You look at the architecture of the global economy, and, well, there's this built-in expectation that you're going to see visible machinery. Like you expect a giant transparent clock.
Right, with all the gears perfectly lined up.
Exactly. You watch a massive gear turn in one place, like an interest rate hike in London, and you anticipate exactly which lever it's going to push on the other side of the world in Tokyo.
Because we crave that clean, mechanical cause and effect. It
Yeah.
gives us this sense of control, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's comforting to categorize these massive global systems into predictable rules, like you buy a barrel of crude, the money moves, the ship sails, and the system just ticks forward.
But the reality is rarely that neat.
It really isn't, because then you step into the realm of global reserve currencies, and specifically this massive looming concept of the petrodollar, and suddenly that transparent clockwork just completely shatters.
Yeah, we are definitely not looking at gears anymore. We're staring into a solid black box.
A completely black box, and lately the alarm bells going off inside that box are just deafening. I mean, we are looking at a stack of recent, highly concerning headlines for this deep dive.
And these aren't from fringe blogs either.
No, not at all. These are from incredibly reputable financial outlets. We're talking the Financial Times, Bloomberg, you name it. And the consensus forming across these pages is that the United States dollar's dominance over the globe is, well, actively crumbling.
They are basically arguing that the era of American financial supremacy is reaching its twilight.
Right. So our goal for you today is to cut through that specific layer of media hype, pry open that black box, and decode whether the petrodollar is genuinely dying or if we are just completely misinterpreting the data.
And, I mean, the stakes on this specific question really couldn't be higher. We are talking about the foundational plumbing of how the modern world functions.
It touches everything, right? Everything. It dictates the baseline cost of capital for every business, the price of goods on retail shelves, and honestly, the ultimate leverage nations use to wage economic warfare. To understand if it's dying, we really have to look at the anatomy of the system we currently have.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core mythology driving these panicked headlines rests on a very specific, highly intuitive assumption. Let's just define the terms first so we're all on the same page.
Good idea.
So a petrodollar is, in simple terms, just a US dollar that an oil exporting country receives in exchange for its crude oil. And a reserve currency is simply the currency that central banks and financial institutions around the world prefer to hold in their vaults for safety.
Right, the go-to money.
Exactly. And the popular logic goes like this. Practically all global oil is priced and sold in US dollars. So since absolutely every industrialized and developing nation requires crude oil to run their economies, it creates a scenario where every nation implicitly requires US dollars. The assumption there is that it's this perpetual motion machine of demand. Like oil is the lifeblood of the global economy, the dollar is the only acceptable medium to acquire that lifeblood. So therefore, the world has a permanent, unquenchable thirst for American currency.
And according to the conventional narrative, that unquenchable thirst gives the United States a profound, almost unfair superpower.
Well, absolutely. Exorbitant privilege.
Right. If the entire planet is constantly clamoring for your currency just to keep their lights on and their trucks moving, you can theoretically borrow staggering amounts of money. You can run massive budget deficits that would, trigger hyperinflation in any other sovereign nation.
And you can unilaterally cripple a foreign adversary by simply locking them out of the dollar network.
Exactly. To use an analogy here, think of it kind of like an exclusive theme park. You can only buy the food and go on the rides using a special park token.
Okay, I like that.
So the prevailing myth assumes that this park token is globally valuable solely because people really, really want the park's food. The fear is that if a new rule allows countries to buy the food with a different token, the entire American theme park collapses.
What's fascinating here is that while the theme park token logic feels incredibly bulletproof, it is actually vastly overstated in the modern financial architecture.
Wait, overstated?
No, completely. The mechanical physical link between a barrel of oil and a US dollar bill is actually a massive distraction from the structural forces governing global finance.
A distraction, but it forms the entire basis of all the geopolitical anxiety we're seeing right now in the news.
It fuels the anxiety, certainly, but global finance rarely obeys that kind of simple linear logic anymore. The idea that the mere invoicing convention, just pricing oil in dollars, is the central load-bearing pillar of American currency dominance is a deeply flawed premise. The mechanical link is an illusion.
Wow. Okay, but to truly understand why that link is a distraction, We have to first examine the very real, very loud geopolitical sparks that are making those Bloomberg and FT editors hit publish on these doomsday narratives.
Exactly. We have to look at the immediate threats because for decades, the quote-unquote death of the petrodollar was basically relegated to the fringes.
Yeah, you'd find it buried on niche macroeconomic blogs or like in the comment sections of doomsday financial prep forums. It wasn't mainstream analysis at all.
But over the last 18 months, the narrative has violently shifted to the front pages. And that's largely driven by escalating tangible tensions across the Middle East and Eastern Europe.
We are seeing major sovereign players make overt moves against the dollar network. Let's start with case study number 1, Iran.
Right. The transition from fringe theory to stated geopolitical policy here is remarkable. We've seen a steady stream of credible reports indicating Tehran is explicitly attempting to destabilize the petrodollar.
And this isn't a hidden agenda, is it?
Not at all. It's a strategic objective. They have been actively exploring mandates that would require any oil tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz to price their energy cargoes in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars.
Which is an incredible pressure point. I mean, for you listening, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another shipping lane. It is arguably the most vital, congested energy choke point on the planet.
Millions of barrels of crude pass through that narrow waterway every single day.
Right. So if Iran successfully leverages geography to force yuan pricing at that choke point, they are essentially setting up a non-dollar toll booth on the world's energy highway.
It is a direct geographical assault on the dollar's traditional invoicing monopoly. And simultaneously, we are seeing a structural shift play out with Russia.
Case study number 2. And just a quick note here for the listener, we are analyzing this strictly through the lens of macroeconomic mechanics. We aren't taking political sides on the conflict, we're just impartially reporting on the economic facts from our sources.
Exactly. And the stark financial reality is that following the imposition of sweeping Western financial sanctions, Russia found itself suddenly heavily restricted from utilizing the dollar-based global banking network.
So they were essentially cut off.
Yes. And in response to being cut off, Moscow was forced to pivot a highly significant portion of its international energy trade away from dollar settlements entirely.
Right. They shifted to using rubles or rupees in the case of their trade with India. And regardless of the geopolitical context, the sheer mechanics of that are fascinating. A massive top-tier global energy producer was structurally excised from the dollar system, and the oil kept flowing anyway.
It proved definitively that crude can clear the market without touching an American bank. It provided a live-fire proof of concept that non-dollar energy trade is viable at scale.
And while Iran is utilizing geographic threats and Russia is utilizing forced workarounds, we have case study number 3. China.
Right. China has been executing a much quieter, highly strategic, long-term play. Beijing has been steadily expanding yuan-denominated oil futures contracts on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange.
Let's pull the lens back on what that actually means for the plumbing of global markets. Because they aren't just like asking for yuan, they are building the heavy infrastructure.
Precisely. China has constructed a massive, official, state-backed marketplace in Shanghai. It allows international commodity traders, hedgers, and producers to buy and sell contracts for the future delivery of oil.
And the entire clearing mechanism operates strictly in Chinese yuan, right?
Exactly. They're methodically laying down the complex financial piping required to route massive international energy transactions completely outside the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury.
Okay, wait, hold on. I need to push back here. Because if I am synthesizing the sheer scale of what you just laid out, the doomsday headlines actually seem completely justified.
Oh, the optics are undeniably dramatic.
Right. I mean, we have Iran threatening the physical choke point of global energy with a yuan mandate. We have Russia, one of the top 3 oil producers on Earth, actively and successfully selling its crude outside the dollar network. And we have China building a dedicated, robust exchange in Shanghai.
It's a very compelling narrative.
If you have the producer, the buyer, and the geographic choke point all actively coordinating to bypass the dollar, how is that not an immediate fatal blow to the petrodollar? Are these notable cases genuinely denting the dollar, or are they just making a lot of noise?
It looks exactly like a coordinated demolition from the outside. But this is where macroeconomic analysis requires us to look past the political theater. When you dive into the data, you begin to see why these specific threats, as loud as they are, consistently fall short.
I'm really struggling to see why they fall short, though. The mechanics are clearly working for them.
It comes down to two insurmountable hurdles for any challenger currency scale and systemic structure. First, let's address the scale of the Shanghai Exchange. Those yuan-denominated oil contracts are growing, absolutely. But you have to view them against the staggering immensity of the global oil market.
It's still pretty small in comparison.
The Shanghai volume is a puddle next to an ocean. The vast, overwhelming majority of global energy transactions, the hedging, the swaps, the physical deliveries, are still fundamentally tied to the dollar network, because that is where the absolute deepest pools of global liquidity reside.
Okay, so Shanghai is functioning as like a boutique alternative, not a wholesale replacement. It proves the plumbing works, but nobody is moving their main water supply through it.
It proves it is possible, but it completely fails to prove it is preferred by the global market. And the reason it isn't preferred brings us to the second, much larger hurdle, the structure of the challenger's financial system.
Which is China's financial system in this case.
Exactly. The Chinese economy is massive, but its financial architecture currently lacks three non-negotiable prerequisites for hosting a true global reserve currency. It lacks depth, openness, and institutional credibility.
Let's break those three down because that sounds like the actual barrier to entry that nobody talks about. Let's start with depth.
Depth refers to the availability of safe, reliable, and varied financial assets. If a major oil producer, like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, suddenly earns 100 billion Chinese yuan selling crude to Beijing, they can't just stuff that cash under a mattress.
Right, they have to invest it somewhere to generate a yield.
Exactly. The U.S. financial market provides an ocean of depth, trillions of dollars in highly liquid treasury bonds, corporate debt, and equities. If you have $100 billion, the U.S. market can absorb it instantly without a ripple.
And the Chinese market?
The Chinese bond market, by comparison, is still relatively shallow and heavily restricted for foreign sovereign capital. There simply aren't enough safe places to park that much petro-yuan.
Which brings us to openness. I mean, if I earn a massive surplus in yuan, can I actually move it?
That is the fatal flaw in the challenger narrative. Openness means the absolute freedom of capital mobility. The United States allows capital to flow in and out of its borders with almost zero friction.
While China operates under strict state-managed capital controls, right?
Precisely. The central government heavily regulates how much money is allowed to leave the domestic economy. If you are a foreign nation accumulating petro-yuan, you face the very real risk that Beijing might not permit you to easily convert that wealth or move it out of the country when you need it.
Wow. And if you can't guarantee access to your own sovereign wealth without asking a foreign government for permission, it fundamentally cannot serve as your primary reserve currency. It defeats the entire purpose of a reserve.
It completely defeats the purpose. And that lack of guaranteed access destroys the third pillar, institutional credibility. Global investors hold dollars not just because of the U.S. economy, but because the U.S. dollar is backed by an independent central bank and a legal system that historically enforces contract law and protects property rights.
And foreign sovereign wealth funds just do not currently have that requisite level of absolute, unshakable trust in the institutional framework of the Chinese financial system.
No, they don't. So when you strip away the dramatic headlines, the stark reality is that there is no alternative reserve currency genuinely waiting in the wings. The euro has structural fragmentation issues, and the yuan is fundamentally too closed off.
So synthesizing this, if these geopolitical threats aren't the actual dagger to the petrodollar, how does the system actually function today? Let's look at the plumbing of modern oil markets and current practices.
To understand current practices, we have to completely deconstruct the myth that purchasing oil requires hoarding physical U.S. dollars.
Because the doomsday narrative assumes we are still operating with the financial constraints of the 1970s.
Exactly. But modern global financial markets, specifically the evolution of derivative and currency swap markets, have totally undermined the need to physically hold dollars just to execute an energy trade.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to clarify these currency swap markets because the jargon can get incredibly dense. It's exactly like using a modern travel credit card.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Imagine you're on a trip to Paris. You sit down in a cafe, order an espresso, and the waiter hands you the bill. The bill is obviously denominated in euros. But you didn't go to a currency exchange booth at the airport. You don't have a single physical euro in your pocket.
You just hand them your standard American travel card.
You tap it, the machine beeps, and the transaction is approved. In the fraction of a millisecond between you tapping that card and the machine approving the purchase, your bank seamlessly handled the currency conversion in the background.
The cafe gets the euros instantly, and you just pay your regular dollar bill.
The fact that the oil contract is denominated in dollars is just a convention, like the cafe menu being in euros. It's not a hard constraint.
That is brilliant. Global financial institutions essentially act as that travel credit card network for sovereign nations. Because of these deep, sophisticated currency swap markets, it is entirely routine for a country like India to negotiate an oil purchase from a Gulf state using Indian rupees, even if the underlying contract is anchored to a US dollar price.
The vast network of international clearing banks manages the conversion seamlessly.
Exactly. Sovereign nations simply do not need to stockpile mountains of US dollar reserves solely to ensure they can keep their domestic energy grids online.
So the panic that oil requires dollars is fundamentally obsolete. And there is a second major macroeconomic shift that deconstructs the myth even further. We have to look at the data surrounding oil intensity.
Yes, oil intensity is a crucial economic metric. It basically measures the precise volume of physical crude oil required to produce one single unit of gross domestic product, or GDP.
It tracks how addicted an economy is to oil in order to generate wealth. And the data shows this is steadily declining worldwide, isn't it?
Plummeting, actually. Across almost all major developed and developing economies, the amount of oil needed to generate $1 of GDP has been dropping for decades.
And that's due to what, energy efficiency?
Energy efficiency is a huge part. We have vastly more efficient internal combustion engines and industrial processes than we did in the 1970s. But it's also the fundamental restructuring of developed economies away from heavy industry and toward the service sector.
Right, creating a software app generates a lot of GDP but doesn't require burning a ton of crude oil.
Precisely. And third, the accelerating integration of renewable energy sources, solar, wind, nuclear, they're taking larger shares of the baseline energy grid. We literally need less oil to make $1 than we did in 1973.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If the mechanical need to hold dollars to buy oil has been made obsolete by currency swaps, and if the global economy is becoming structurally less dependent on oil anyway, then what is the actual engine? What is the true structural foundation of dollar hegemony?
To locate the true engine, you have to stop looking at the energy markets and start looking at the bond markets. You have to understand the historical mechanics of petrodollar recycling.
Petrodollar recycling. This is the mechanism that actually matters. Take us back to 1974. How did this recycling mechanism start?
Well, following the massive OPEC oil price surges in the early 1970s, major oil exporting nations, particularly Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, were suddenly flooded with a tidal wave of cash.
Which sounds great on paper, but it presented a massive structural crisis, right?
Huge crisis. In the 1970s, the domestic economies of these Gulf states were highly underdeveloped. They completely lacked the domestic economic capacity to absorb the money they were earning.
If they tried to spend it all domestically, it would have triggered catastrophic hyperinflation.
Exactly. Too much money chasing too few goods. They desperately needed a safe, highly liquid offshore vault to park that wealth.
And this is where the actual architecture of American financial dominance was forged. In 1974, there was a highly strategic secret agreement established between Saudi Arabia and the United States.
The Saudis agreed to take their massive surplus of petrodollars and systematically recycle them back into the U.S. financial system. They did this primarily by purchasing enormous quantities of U.S. government debt treasury bonds.
And in exchange for financing America's national debt, they received an implicit American military security guarantee.
That was the core synergy, and it engineered a self-reinforcing virtuous cycle. The dollar was a premier currency of trade, making U.S. treasuries the ultimate safe haven asset. And because everyone needed to buy treasuries to safely store their wealth, it created a permanent structural demand for the U.S. dollars required to purchase those bonds.
So this recycling loop, not the trivial mechanics of an oil invoice, was the concrete structural foundation. But the mission of this deep dive is to determine if this era is actually ending. Why is this current practice of recycling fading today?
The data strongly suggests the engine is failing for two very distinct reasons. First, the major global oil exporters are no longer running the massive, unspendable capital surpluses that forced them into the U.S. Treasury market in the 1970s.
The macroeconomic equation has entirely transformed, and the research highlights Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 as the primary catalyst.
Right. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's intensely ambitious plan to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil.
Because constructing a modern, diversified economy from scratch requires an astronomical amount of domestic capital expenditure. They are pouring money into massive domestic projects, mega cities like NEOM, global sports leagues, tech funds.
They have a massive domestic sinkhole for every dollar they earn now. Because of this spending spree, Saudi Arabia has actually been running fiscal and trade deficits in recent years. And if you have no surplus, you mathematically have no money to recycle into U.S. debt.
The pipeline of capital is drying up at the source, but what about when there is a surplus? That brings us to the second, much more alarming reason the recycling engine is failing.
This second reason strikes at the heart of American financial supremacy. Treasuries are no longer the automatic safe haven.
The source material isolates a highly specific, deeply anomalous event in the bond markets recently that proves this.
Yes. If you analyze the bond market's reaction to the recent severe escalations of conflict in the Middle East, the behavior was entirely unprecedented. Historically, during a war in the Middle East, frightened global investors initiate a massive flight to safety, and they buy U.S. Treasury bonds.
Right, which drives the price of the bonds up and the yields, the interest rate the U.S. has to pay down. Crisis historically meant cheaper borrowing costs for the United States.
But during these recent conflicts, the exact opposite happened. Tensions escalated, but the price of U.S. Treasuries actually plummeted. Global investors were actively selling off American debt in the middle of a geopolitical crisis.
And the yield on 30-year U.S. bonds spiked dramatically, climbing from around 4.6% to nearly 4.9% in a very short window.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this unprecedented sell-off points to a much deeper domestic problem for the U.S. It reveals that global investors are fundamentally questioning the underlying safety of the American sovereign debt market itself.
Okay, this brings us to the critical threshold of our deep dive, the future implications. I want to use a final, concrete analogy to separate the noise from the signal. Imagine you are driving your car at high speed, and suddenly a bright red warning light flashes aggressively on your dashboard.
Right, it demands your attention immediately.
Exactly. The decline of the petrodollar, all those headlines about Iran, Russia, China, that is just the warning light flashing on the dashboard. The warning light is scary, but it's just a symptom. The actual lethal danger is the catastrophic engine failure happening silently under the hood.
That framing is essential. The real structural threats to the U.S. dollar, the engine failures, are entirely domestic.
So let's open the hood and examine the actual machinery. Based on the research, there are three massive domestic threats we need to analyze. What is risk number one?
The first risk is the sheer scale of the outstanding U.S. national debt. We are talking about tens of trillions of dollars in obligations reaching levels that give even sympathetic investors serious pause.
At a certain threshold, sovereign wealth funds look at that debt pile and the rising cost of servicing the interest, and they have to ask if the U.S. can actually ever repay it without just printing massive amounts of new currency and inflating the debt away.
And the fear of systemic monetization is the ultimate poison for a reserve currency. If global investors suspect inflation will eat away their yield, they preemptively stop buying the bonds.
Which flows directly into the second major structural risk. And a quick note for you listening. We must frame this strictly as an economic risk factor analyzed by financial markets, avoiding any partisan agreement or disagreement with the sources.
Right. The research points heavily to political interference and assaults on the institutional independence of the Federal Reserve. It specifically mentions the previous Trump administration's assault, but the core economic principle is universal.
For any fiat currency to maintain absolute trust, the central bank must remain fiercely independent. They must be able to make painful monetary decisions based purely on data, completely insulated from the short-term desires of politicians.
Because global capital markets crave predictability. If they perceive the Fed as just a political tool taking orders from the executive branch, they will instantly lose faith in the integrity of the dollar. The institutional credibility of the Fed is the firewall.
And that leads us to the third threat, the severe erosion of rule of law credibility, making investors fear their assets could be arbitrarily seized.
When a foreign central bank parks hundreds of billions in U.S. treasuries, they are trusting the American legal system. But the aggressive deployment of sweeping financial sanctions against Russia sent a terrifying signal to the rest of the world.
It proved the United States is willing and able to weaponize the core infrastructure of the global financial system.
It forces every other nation to run a new risk calculation. If holding U.S. dollars is viewed as a geopolitical liability, countries will methodically begin searching for the exits.
So, if the petrodollar is a distraction, what practical takeaways can we give the listener? What metrics actually matter?
There are three practical indicators to watch. Number one, watch the behavior of the U.S. Treasury market during moments of acute global stress. Do they still attract safe haven flows, or do yields spike because investors are dumping them?
Indicator 2.
Monitor the specific pace at which global central banks actively diversify their foreign exchange reserves. You can track this through the IMF's data. If central banks aggressively dump dollars for gold or alternative assets, that signals a profound structural abandonment.
And the third indicator.
Pay acute attention to the institutional independence of the Federal Reserve. Monitor the political rhetoric and legislative actions surrounding the central bank.
Those are incredibly sharp metrics to track. And diving this deeply inevitably opens up new avenues of inquiry. So here are 3 knowledge gap questions you should ponder and research next to deepen your understanding.
These are the structural dilemmas top analysts are wrestling with right now.
Question number 1. How exactly do central banks go about diversifying their massive reserve holdings safely without accidentally crashing the very markets they are holding?
It is an incredibly delicate tightrope.
Question number 2. What specific metrics or milestones determine if a foreign financial system finally has enough depth and openness to become a true global reserve currency?
Identifying that exact threshold is a fascinating area of research.
And question number 3. How does a country practically and legally protect its central bank's independence from political interference during turbulent times?
Understanding that legal reinforcement is vital.
So what does this all mean? We have synthesized a 60-minute journey here. The hysteria you read in those articles gets the causality backwards.
Yep.
Dollar hegemony was never primarily about oil invoices.
It was built on deep capital markets, institutional trust, and geopolitical power.
The petrodollar narrative is seductive because it offers a clean, mechanical story. Control the oil invoice, control the world. But the real world is far messier.
The fading of the petrodollar will just be a footnote in the much larger story of American fiscal credibility.
Exactly. I want to address you directly with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've established that dollar dominance relies on institutional trust and the absence of a credible alternative. So if the traditional foundation of a global currency requires absolute trust in a single nation's institutions, and we are seeing that trust fracture under political and debt pressures, what happens when the world simply runs out of perfectly trustworthy nations?
It's a huge question.
Will the next global reserve currency even belong to a country at all? Or will it have to be a system built entirely outside of national borders, like decentralized digital architectures, to guarantee that missing trust?
That is the macroeconomic question that will define the next century.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope we've helped clear away the muddy waters and open up that black box for you. Keep questioning the headlines, and we will catch you next time.